Delighted to be able to speak to you today about social work education because actually I first became involved with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation because I became concerned about some of the kinds of comments and beliefs I was encountering in the students that I teach. And I'm convinced somewhat that in fact they were not hearing these ideas necessarily within the classroom, at least at our school. On the other hand, it became, this is like a couple of years ago, it became increasingly clear to me that we were not doing enough to discourage these ideas since clearly some of our students were still espousing them. And so that's kind of the route that I got first to becoming involved and the concern I had. What I want to try to do today is to give you some ideas about the profession of social work and to try to explain some of that. The social work, like psychiatry, is a practice, not a science. And that means that it may draw upon information and knowledge from a variety of sources. It's important in the sense that social work began and still has a focus and concerns about problems in basically social behavior and things of that sort. But today, as you may have heard implied in what Dr. Dawes said earlier, the majority of mental health practitioners are in fact clinical social workers. And so that does make a difference to the kinds of concerns that you have, and their education ought to make, therefore, some difference to you. Now, there are a whole variety of theoretical approaches that are involved in social work, and that's not necessarily bad. After all, the kinds of those kinds of arguments and discussions between differing perspectives in any kind of discipline or science is part of how it is that knowledge grows. So that's a good thing. One of the things I want to make clear to you is that the kind of thinking, and which I think is not news to you by this time in the conference, the kind of thinking that is underneath, to the extent that one can call it thinking, that is underneath the recovered memory kinds of therapies, is not simply a difference in some kind of different theoretical approach. It is a simplistic approach to treatment. Okay, from any one of the perspectives that might be taken on it. I want to tell you about my own approach and my own theoretical perspective just briefly, which is that basically I've always taken my knowledge from what is kind of a very traditional approach to social work that probably goes back to the 1940s and 1950s, actually. It was called sort of casework in those days. I've done individual, family, group therapy, as well as myself, as well as to teach. I basically take a pretty much psychodynamic perspective, and I do consider myself also to be something of a feminist. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because what I'm about to do is to give you my story of something that has happened within the social work profession, and particularly within social work education, in the last 30 to 40 years. And I want you to be aware that since my story is invariably going to have inaccuracies, that you ought to know what my perspective on this is so you can tell something about where the biases might be coming from. what I want to do is to kind of, in some ways, answer or give you my answer, because I've become rather puzzled as to how it is that a profession of which I'm extremely proud, which has as part of its aims the relief of human suffering from social ills, and the profession to which I've dedicated now over 30 years of my life, how can we have become involved in something like recovered memory therapy? Now, I'm not trying to imply that the whole profession is involved in it. Quite frankly, I don't think we know. The survey that Dr. Lindsay reported on was, as you noticed, psychologists and not social workers, and I don't know whether there are more social workers, a higher percentage of social workers involved in this, or whether there are in fact less. At this point, it's hard for me to say. But what I want to do is to try to give you something of my answer of how it is possible and what conditions have led to some of this. In order to begin to give you some background to do that, what I've got to do is tell you a little bit about the peculiarities and traditions within the profession of social work. First of all, social work has always had a perspective that said, remember this is a social perspective, so one of the things that we've done is to look at the idea of the person in the environment, okay? We've always believed that people were influenced by their environments, and if you took them out of them, you wouldn't be able to understand. So that's been traditionally one of the perspectives. Now, well, each of these perspectives, as I mention them to you, you see, have some strengths and some weaknesses in relation to vulnerability to the kinds of things that are underneath recovered memory therapy. Obviously, in this sense, presumably in traditional social work, there would not be just a whole lot of investment or involvement in looking at some kind of just pure intrapsychic or purely unconscious kind of notion here. Social work traditionally has placed a major emphasis and value on the family, on the positive aspects and the necessities for human beings to live in closely associated kinship or affective groups, and that was important. Obviously, in terms of this, I said that seems to me is a very strong and important value in the field that ought to be a strength in this regard. Although I suppose one can say then they become quick targets for blame if you want to do that. Social work has always had a tradition that believes strongly in client determinism and a cliche in social work that's called starting where the client is. Okay? What it means is you deal with what the person is saying. You don't lay a theory on top of them. Okay? You don't take some kind of idea of, I think this is what causes, or this is what happened, and you're dealing with what they're telling you about what is happening. This is what's important in terms of the perspective. Social work has always been a profession that believed more in any kind of beneficial effect coming from the relationship with the client, and the influence that could have, rather than necessarily some kind of insight that a person had. So that there's been an attempt to think about how it is that one uses a relationship rather than necessarily relying on particular beliefs one way or another. Social work has a long tradition of advocacy. See? That grows out of a conviction that in fact there's always an overlap. I hope most of you will agree that in relation to the problems that bring us here today, there is an overlap between the social aspects of the problem and the personal aspects of the problem. You can't fully divide those things. They exist, they're there. There is a relationship between what goes on in the society and what happens in all of our personal lives. And finally, social work has traditionally been a women's profession. Okay? It traditionally has been the profession with the most social status, probably has attracted historically some of the brightest and best women around. Okay. So that, as it turns out, I've always thought of that as a strength. As it turns out, as we begin to look at some of the developments, that turns out that that has some weaknesses in it. We will come to see. Now, what I'm going to do now is to give you a brief history of the last 30 to 40 years from the perspective now that I've given you, to try to tell you my constructed story about how this happened. I'm going to begin with about the 1960s, at which point in time you will recall we had Lyndon Johnson and the programs of the Great Society. Social work as a profession thrived during that time. There was lots of federal money for social programs, and there was a lot of stimulation and stimulus in the social work schools to participate and be involved in what were very idealistic social policy and social planning programs, with the idea that we were going to somehow eliminate a lot of the very real social problems that we have. At the same time that this was going on, what one had was an increasing criticism of what we now call the clinical or casework part of the profession. Social policy advocates were apt to tell those of us within the profession who were clinicians that we were, quote, adjusting people to a sick society. And those of us who were clinicians in terms of the theoretical knowledge at the time had very little way of being able to argue with that. I think I could do that much better today, but at the time we didn't know very much about how to do that. What's interesting about this is that in the 60s was a time when the makeup of the profession also changed. The leadership of the profession until about that time had been, not exclusively, but fairly heavily women, and they were mostly clinicians. At this point in time, there was a shift in which it became mostly men who were, in fact, not clinicians. Now, outside in the society at this point in time, one had, you will recall, the Encounter movement, which also began to criticize and which had a kind of critical eye on clinical work in terms of saying, well, is enough. Something I've never quite been able to stomach. But it was true. That was the idea. Love is enough. And also then meaning criticism of the idea of some kind of clinical work. As we moved into the 70s, there was a move in social work, and remember, social work, I should have told you, social work does not just clinicians. It's important to understand that. They're the bulk of the profession, they're the largest numbers, but many people in social workers are policy experts, have primary expertise in research or in administration of public agencies or social agencies, things of that sort. Now, in the 1970s, what you had was a growth of a lot of doctoral programs. They were almost exclusively based in research. Few of them addressed clinical issues in any kind of very direct way, and few of the people who taught in them had any kind of clinical expertise. Okay? However, what began to happen was that these people took what was basically social research methodology, social survey research methodology, and began to say that it was scientific for them to take this methodology and impose it on clinical practice, and that didn't have to know anything about clinical practice in order to be able to research it. Now, and they kept saying this was touted as good science. Let me point out to you that is not good science. Okay? Because good science means you have to know something not just about methodology, but about the content and the substance of what it is you're trying to learn about. But this was a movement within social work that happened in that sense. What also happened, of course, in the 70s, and you are well aware of this, there was outside, but sometimes supported by some social workers, not all, I might add. There was the social work, the Child Abuse Reporting Act came into in this period of time, and the reporting of abuse became mandatory, and a lot of clinicians became worried about because they'd be in trouble legally if they didn't report, and that's a setup for over-reporting, in case you don't know that, because people feel they got to protect themselves. Okay? You had the growth of the recovery movement, which now became a popular thing. This is again happening outside the profession of social work. The self-help and the AA recovery movement and what is happening in that sense. And within social work, at this point in time, you had a continuing de-emphasis on clinical work, so that what was pushed as good clinical intervention was very often stuff that was simplistic, concrete, but the idea behind what it was that it was easily measurable. It was obvious. It was easily measurable. It wasn't just this kind of talk therapy. And what happened, and if you think about it, you see, all of the techniques behind recovered memory therapy are specific, or a lot of them at least, are specific kinds of things, or can be thought of and used in very concrete, specific ways that are easily measurable. And you begin to see how some of this comes out, how these things connect. You also had the feminist movement in the 70s. That was a natural to have a major influence on social work. And here's where I say, you see, social work as a profession is very responsive to what goes on in society. It's bound to be. That is both a strength and a weakness in the profession. That's important to understand. And it was particularly natural because by now what had happened in the schools was that although 80% of the students wanted to study clinical work, the clinical faculty, which was mostly the women, also, see, there was this convergence, not entirely, of course, but convergence of the clinical faculty were women and the policy faculty were men for the most part, and the researchers and the administrators. By this time, 80% of the students who came to schools of social work wanted to study clinical work, and 80% of the faculty were non-clinicians. What that meant was that the 20% of the faculty had to teach 80% of the students, while what they were doing was being criticized by their colleagues, diminished by them in that sense, and then they were turned around and being criticized for the fact that they didn't also publish very much. Well, they felt abused. Why wouldn't they? And these people were all also women. Can't exactly blame them very much if they weren't a little angry about it, and if they didn't also think that maybe some of this had something to do with some kind of sexist-based problem, or that there wasn't some kind of connection with that sort of thing. So, okay, what you have then is a situation in which the feminists, who had also already repudiated Freud, on the basis of things like the Oedipus complex, which was seen to be sexist, were in some ways set up to hear people like Jeffrey Mason, who attacking Freud and saying, well, you're abusing, Freud was simply abusing women and children by disavowing the trauma theory. Now, you had a convergence here that was very interesting because many of these feminists had no idea that when in endorsing a trauma theory, they were in fact endorsing the early, unthought through Freud that they thought they were arguing against. Many of them didn't even know that, because of the simple fact that Freud already hadn't been taught in the schools of social work for 15 or so years. And you see, part of the problem is that Freud's work, however much and whatever you may think of it, has been kind of the base for a lot of what goes on in all of the therapies, and therefore to not study it is ridiculous, because then you don't know where you got the ideas or what their implications are, and you lose a lot of the complexity of what this is about. So what we had then was a peculiar convergence of an emphasis on a kind of simplistic and pseudoscientific approach to treatment, the popularization of the self-help and recovery movements, anger over legitimate child abuse and sexism, and coming together with a diminishment of an emphasis on clinical work and of good clinical training. And that becomes the fertile ground for then the recovered memory theorists and people who developed, as far as I know, somewhat outside, certainly outside the professional organizations of social work. But it was fertile ground, I think, for this to take off somewhat. And it's important, you see, one of the things I want to point out to you here about this is that it's important to understand that what has gone on in relation to the false memory syndrome and that sort of stuff is that any good disciplined social worker knows that the way in which you deal with real problems of social injustice, such as exist in child abuse and in sexism, the way you deal with that is not to then turn around and perpetuate social injustice by scapegoating somebody else. That's just not right. The other thing I want to point out to you is that the simplistic notion, as far as I'm concerned at least, or one of the major problems with it, in dealing with therapy, that underlies this kind of, the way in which people are taking recovered memory therapy, has to do with the fact that there is this kind of funny assumption that therapy has to undo the cause, okay? Now, that isn't to say you don't want to use causal information or good scientific information, but the overlap between scientific information and how it's applied to practice isn't a one-to-one simple relationship. It doesn't work that way. You know, if somebody has been sexually abused, you can't undo it. There's no way you can do that. It's happened. Whatever has happened in our lives is past. It's happened. You use information about cause sometimes, but what you're doing in treatment when you don't know anyway, I mean, there's no way. Scientific studies have to use groups. You have to use a whole lot of careful things. When Mrs. Jones walks into your office, therapists don't know what caused her problem. You can try to find out, you can have hypotheses about it and whatever, but you've never, in a scientific sense, you never know. So that anything that you have, any idea you have about the cause can always only be a hypothesis. Therapy, therefore, this idea of the importance of cause in that sense is a very bad and destructive one in using it in that way. What's important to recognize is, in therapy, what you're dealing with is not the cause, but the effects, whatever the cause was. And one thing Freud was very clear about was that the existence of multiple causality, lots of things can cause a lot of other things, and this is not a one-to-one kind of notion. So that what you're doing when somebody comes in and has a problem in relation to behavior or thinking or whatever, what you're doing is you're dealing with the effect. You don't have to know the cause. Exactly, in specific details, you're dealing with how the person is functioning at this point, and that's what you're addressing. In other words, what we need is a shift away from a kind of archaeological metaphor for treatment, as if what we were doing is digging up the past, to a more constructive and rehabilitative approach to what therapy is about. And that's very important. Now, what I want to do then, I see that essentially my time is up. I'll just very quickly say to you, I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of an idea about some of the conditions that have led to this. And the question what I haven't gotten to is there hope? And I think there is. I think some of these things are changing. I think there are reasons why they're changing. But one thing's for sure, and that is that those changes are only beginning, and that what happens is that you and I must continue to advocate for improvements and for good clinical training. Thank you.